We'll try not to embarrass anybody.
So
All right,
Bill,
how
you
many?
gonna
We've got
tell us about Elmer Gantry, Bill?
Sir?
You're gonna quote Elmer Gantry?
I think I'm good. I'm going to have a hard time from now on having used Billy Sunday. I don't want to get in real trouble.
Bigger screen.
I see Dennis. I haven't seen Dennis for a while. Dennis, are you still here in Davidson, or have you moved?
He's in Chapel Hill.
I've moved to Chapel Hill. I moved January 20th, actually. So I've been here almost 2 months. And
Okay.
it's a retirement facility called Carolina Meadows.
Yes.
And the reason principally is I have a daughter in Durham and a son in Raleigh. So it's a couple grandchildren in the area. Nicer to get closer to them.
Well, welcome to the class today. And I've been very involved with all of the CCRCs, and I know Carolina Meadows pretty well. It's a very nice facility.
I really enjoy it.
Good, good.
The trouble is, we're confined. They're delivering all the meals, so you can't meet people at restaurants and things like that. But time will pass. A lot of people are taking walks and all.
Have you found a choir yet? Or are you under such quarantine you can't sing?
We can't sing, but there's talk of a choir, maybe even of a barbershop quartet, perhaps.
All right.
Good.
Don, you want to move to Chapel Hill?
Pardon?
I was asking John if he wanted to move to Chapel Hill to be in a quartet.
No, Dennis and I have had a little experience as a kind of a taxi squad member as a courseman with Dennis, which was great. The highlight of my music career.
Well, see, I have all those jokes I used to tell John, and I had to get a new audience to tell them to.
Well, you just go ahead. I know the punchlines.
Well, you need to share on this program.
I think it's time to start. Our time has come and we have 16 screens working, so maybe we can generate some discussion. Again, congratulations for setting your clocks ahead and getting here on time. I guess I want to start with a few comments or ask you if there's anything hanging over loose ends from last week. After the class and our discussion of Billy Sunday and his attitude toward the Ku Klux Klan, Mary Thornberry did some more research and she inspired me to do a little bit more online. And we discovered, I suppose, not quite the worst news, but that he was not critical of the Klan. He did receive money. Their money was as green as anyone else's, and he accepted donations from the Klan. I found an article, maybe this is the same one that Mary found, that after a service in Bangor, Maine, the service was interrupted. His sermon was interrupted by some Klan members who showed up at the meeting. And he was questioned about that. And he's quoted as saying, he did not believe any organization that marched behind the cross of Christ and the American flag could be anything but a power for good. In his sermon, he actually addressed the members of the Klan and he said, they've lied about me and I suppose they have about you too, indicating maybe a common antipathy toward the press. And there's even a suggestion that at a meeting, and I haven't confirmed this, but I'll go ahead and put it out there, that he, in a meeting in Richmond, he had a Klan night, NIGHT, where the Klan was especially invited. Certainly that's not commendable. I will only say maybe it was better that the Klan be at his revival meetings than doing other things they might have been doing. And maybe it did some of them some good. I fear that's not the case. Unfortunately, there's a fairly large history of white supremacy in the both in the evangelical tradition and more specifically in the fundamentalist tradition. But Suffice it to say, the lesson there is that preachers, even preachers, are not beyond being mistaken about some things. Any other comments on that? I just thought we'd clear that up in light of the questions about the flaming cross.
Well, yeah, I don't think the Scots were running around with a flaming cross, actually, like at the end of that particular sermon. And not to talk about cancel culture at all, because I realize that people were somewhat a victim in a sense of what society was like back then. But from what I read about Billy Sunday is he did make more money as a preacher than as a baseball player, which was not unusual. My grandfather had a chance to sign with Comiskey in the White Sox, and he said he did not because he was a young man and he could actually make more money working than he could playing for the White Sox at that point. And I assume that was the same thing with Billy Sunday. The pulpit became much more, I hate to use the word profitable, than lucrative than playing baseball was.
I can't compare with baseball, but it was lucrative for Sunday. He did very well for his time. He lived in Indiana. He had a nice home in Indiana, and then he would go out from there, and they would actually build these tabernacles on site, sawdust floor, the sawdust trail. They put sawdust over the dirt, kept the dust down, and so on. And the other thing about the Klan was a very large organization then, and there are a lot of people that, as you say, Eric, were somewhat naively brought into it. Even some people who became very respected politicians. Harry Byrd, Hugo Black at one time was a member of the Klan. So
Hugo Black used to say that when he was a young man, he dressed up in white robes and scared black people. When he grew up, he dressed up in black robes and scared white people.
well, boys will be boys, right? All right, enough of the Klan. We're going to move on. We come ahead from 1925 until the 1960s, and we have, as some have already observed, very different sermons this week from what we had last week. Is anybody here old enough to remember the 1960s?
Too many of.
Probably all of us.
Jason's
Other than
holding
Megan.
his hand up, see, so we need to educate Jason and maybe others of you. I did a little timeline research. Just think about the 1960s. I was only, a teenager in 1961, but I remember some of this stuff. I suspect you do as well. John Kennedy was president. He was the youngest man to be inaugurated as president, replaced the grandfather figure of Eisenhower in January of 1961. He established the Peace Corps that year. The phrase affirmative action first came into being, using affirmative action to try to remedy some of the disparities in hiring and so on in that year. The Mattel Toy Company realized that Barbie was lonesome, and they issued the Ken doll in 1961. That was certainly an important event. Adolf Eichmann went on trial, being one of the major organizers of the Holocaust. He went on trial, and Israel was eventually convicted. Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. The space race was initiated in the 1960s, specifically in 61. The Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. I mean, there's just so much going on. Facing off with Kennedy, facing off with Khrushchev, and getting into rather heated discussions on the future of Berlin. The Berlin Wall began to be built in 1961. Harper Lee, To Kill a Mockingbird, Pulitzer Prize, 1961, ironically. The first freedom rides by the Congress on Racial Equality, took place in 61. And I believe that in that first year, there was a bombing of one of the buses in Anniston, Alabama. Does anybody with an Alabama background confirm that? I think that was in 61. Kennedy announced the intention to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Let's see what else. Brand new custom built Lincoln Continental convertible was delivered to the White House. We all know that car very well. See if there's anything else. Kennedy delivered a speech hinting that nuclear war might be imminent if the Soviet Union would attempt to take control of Berlin. Some of us were probably still hiding under our desk in those days. Protest for nuclear disarmament began in those years. Soviet tanks and American tanks faced off at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. You know, it was just a decade that was fraught, and a year that was fraught with tension. We sent the first troops, 18,000 troops were sent to Vietnam in 1961, and we officially became involved in the Vietnam War. Fidel Castro proclaimed himself to be a communist, said he had been for a long time, and would lead Cuba as a socialist nation. Adolf Eichmann, as I said, was condemned to death. Gosh, I'm frankly glad the 60s are over. I wish I was still as young as I was in 1961, but I'm glad we don't have to relive those years. In some ways, they seem worse than some stuff we've been through since. Martin Luther King. I didn't know until I did a little research for this particular class that Martin Luther King was originally born and baptized as, not baptized, but born, and on his birth certificate was Michael King. I kind of wonder what his career would have been like if he had remained Michael King. But his father, also a preacher, and as was his grandfather, Baptist preachers, his father made a trip to Europe and was so impressed. This was about when Michael King was about 5 years old. He was so impressed with what he found in Europe and in Germany about Reformed theology, and in particular, Martin Luther, that he, the father, changed his own name to Martin Luther King from Michael, and thus Michael King Jr. became Martin Luther King Jr. And actually, that was when he was 5. And then when he was an adult, sometime in the 1950s, he had his name officially changed to Martin Luther King Jr. What that all means, I don't know, but it certainly has a more preacherly ring, with all apologies to preachers named Mike. Martin Luther King probably was a better name for him. He attended Morehouse College, an all-male Black institution in Atlanta, where he got his undergraduate degree, then went to Crozer Seminary in Pennsylvania, which was a multi-denominational, mostly white seminary. He did very well there. He was elected president of his class. I think he graduated at the top of his class. He was very influenced there by the theology of Walter Rauschenbusch, who we talked about a little bit last week, who had really begun what was come to known as the social gospel. King was also influenced by the ideas of Gandhi and Gandhi's ideas concerning nonviolent change through nonviolent means. He went on to Boston University, where he got his PhD, and it was there that he met his future wife. His first call as a pastor was to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, which, if you've been to Montgomery, sits right down in front of the Capitol building. It's just straight on. He served there and was noted for having led the bus boycott in um, in Montgomery. Interestingly, there was talk of, before Rosa Parks came along, there was talk of beginning that boycott when a young girl was she was told to go to the back of the bus, and the leaders of the movement there decided that they would have a better candidate later, that they might be accused of taking advantage of a minor by using her as sort of the centerpiece of the movement. So later, Rosa Parks gave them another beginning point for the bus boycott. After a while, he moved from Montgomery to Atlanta and became co-pastor at the church that his father was still the pastor, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. I want to say that when Martin Luther King Sr. began there, attendance at that church was 600. And by the time Martin Luther King Jr. arrived, it was in the thousands. So his father had, at least numerically, a successful pastorate there. Not that numbers are everything. They're not even a little thing sometimes, but by those measures, a good pastorate there. And that is where this sermon was delivered in 1961. I don't have the exact date, so I can't relate it to any particular event other than to the tone of the 60s generally. You'll notice that this is much more an exposition of the text from Romans than either of the sermons that we saw last week. Billy Sunday uses the text, his text on the miraculous feeding, as sort of a setup for some metaphorical use. But here, King actually explores, what does this text mean? To not to conform, to have your minds transformed. And he explores the text a bit more fully. And it's a different type of sermon. Last week we had the evangelistic sermon, we had the apologetic sermon. This is much more an encouragement for Christian behavior and Christian action. And if you think about it, it really serves as a basis of all of King's ministry and what he tried to do in the area of civil rights, and also later anti-war and disarmament issues. Paige had some comments. What did you all think of this one? Give me your ideas, and then I want to go through a few things that really struck me. Paige, you want to start us off?
Well, I mentioned to Bill that my reaction is I never realized that he was such a poet in his use of words. He has sentences that if any of us were writing it, we would put down the specifics. And he creates a glow of combinations of words. The altar of self-interest, recapture the gospel glow. Let's see. Truth lies prostrate on the rugged hills of nameless Calvaries. I mean, that's mind-boggling.
Yes, he was noted for that, even in his days in education. He studied the Bible, but he also studied the dictionary. He read the dictionary to develop his linguistic skills and his lexicon. He apparently was a terrible speller. He couldn't spell at all, but he had a very broad vocabulary, even if he didn't spell it correctly. And so, yeah, that was characteristic of him. And I'm sure we all can still hear his voice. He had this wonderful diction. I can't imagine Martin Luther King getting tongue-tied. I mean, I trip over stuff all the time. You know that. You've heard me. I'll get caught on something. I'll find a word I can't say, and I'll, just get all wrapped around the axle. That wasn't King. I don't know if it was discipline. I think it was just an art that he had, that he could speak so precisely and with such clarity, and it was really almost regal in his in the way he delivered a sermon, and you can see it as you read it. Yeah.
I saw this as sort of a theological foundation for Letter from a Birmingham Jail. In other words, the necessity of choice, the necessity of deciding that you are going to be on God's side rather than the side of all those other nice people.
Yeah, yeah, and really, as I said, it's his whole ministry.
Yeah.
It's right here. Why was he doing what he was doing? Well, maybe he was preaching to himself at this point. I don't think so. I think he was beyond that, but he was certainly citing what his impetus was for going through what he went through and leading as he did.
Bill,
Yes.
don't you think that the quality of his preaching was shaped in the Black church, and that's the explanation for his poetry and his diction?
Well, I don't doubt that it was shaped in the Black church. I'm not sure that's the total explanation. I've never heard his father preach. His father was very influential on him insofar as style and his desire to be a minister. He had wanted to be a minister for much of his life. He was really, he really felt very guilty about some things. There were a couple of occasions when he was very young, when things would happen in his life, like his grandmother died or something like that. And he would hold himself responsible, thinking that in some way he had misbehaved and he was being punished by God by this, whatever the tragedy was that happened to someone else. And he was so guilty about it, he tried to kill himself twice when he was a young man by jumping out of the second-story window of his house. Same window, didn't work the first time, didn't work the second time either, but obviously. But he did that out of a sense of guilt for his misbehavior that had caused a problem for either his grandmother or his mother. I've forgotten the exact details. But back to your comment, Charlie, yeah, I think it certainly was. Although, which Black church? We can't, I would think we've talked previously, you can't really stereotype the Black church. He's not Reverend Ike. He's not C.L. Franklin. He's more, I don't know, Calvin Butts, Sam Proctor. Yeah. So, is there a Black church? And I know we've talked about the series on television. Is there really a Black church? Well, maybe. But yeah, certainly that's where he got his training and his image for what a pastor was supposed to be like.
Bill, I love particularly very early in the sermon, he talks about that we are citizens of two worlds. And, that's not an unusual concept, but the way he tags it, the world of time and the world of eternity.
Yeah.
I love those concepts. And of course, he develops those as he goes throughout the sermon. But there were so many good things in this sermon, like Pidge, I was like underlining almost everything.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through my underlining.
He does have a unique turn of the phrase. And even though this is a very familiar passage, he really, as you said, developed it as kind of the foundation for his social action and his call to Christian action again, for racial justice.
And follow that up, Susan, look at the example he gives, the good example he gives, where Paul is writing to the church in Rome. He says, the Romans know what it's like to live as a colony. They've gone out and put colonies all over the place, and yet they live as Roman citizens. So they've got a foot in the foreign country, and they've got a foot as their citizens of Rome. And that's what he says, we know what that's like to be a citizen of heaven and a citizen of the earth. I thought that was just a very effective way of explaining the concept of being having these two loyalties, or the higher loyalty and the lower loyalty, and so on.
Yeah, I did too.
Bill,
Pam?
just
Yeah.
thinking about Susan's reference to the two worlds, and then he ties that to it's your mind, it's the changing of your mind, it happens in your deep soul. And I thought that's so profound. That's where change really happens. It happens in the human heart. And it's a change of mind. And I also thought it was interesting to me when I started to read it, I thought this really isn't just he's delivering it in a Black church, but his audience is at least some white and maybe even largely white, even though he's delivering it into a Black church.
Yeah, and given the civil rights stance, you have to wonder who his main audience was, even though his congregation was predominantly Black.
Yeah.
Is he really talking to the Black members of that congregation, or is he talking to someone else entirely? A good point. And he goes on to say, to follow your point, being a nonconformist is not to your credit necessarily. You can't be a nonconformist just for the sake of being, difficult and sort of setting yourself apart. It has to come from that change of mind, change of heart, to be worthwhile and worthy of being redemptive. So it's not just being different. We've all known a lot of people who are just different. They were nonconformist, and that's about all you could say. But being nonconformist, coming from that spiritual change in order to be redemptive for
I
others.
think that
I was noticing, as Mary was saying earlier, there are places in this sermon which are really precursors to the way in which King will express himself in a letter from a Birmingham jail. One of them being in this a kind of a mild comment to moderate white Christians, which is going to be so specific in letter to Birmingham jail, together with the white ministry. And so he's kind of, these are building blocks here that are going to show up later on.
I don't want to cut you all off, but just a few things that I had highlighted. His use of repetition, I thought was effective. On page 842, if you have the text there, where he's setting out what conformity is. He sort of defines it with a long list of things. And he says, when an affluent society would coax us to believe that happiness consists in the size of our automobiles, when we would yield to the temptation of a world rife with sexual promiscuity, when we refuse to suffer for righteousness and choose to follow a path of comfort rather than conviction, when in our spiritual pride we boast of having reached the peak of moral excellence, when we, through compassionless detachment and arrogant individualism, fail to respond to the needs of the underprivileged, when we allow the spark of revenge in our souls to flame up in hate toward our enemies, that over and over again, when, it's just, there's a cadence to it that I think is very effective. And then some of this image, surely you saw this. Most people, Christians in particular, are thermometers that record or register the temperature of majority opinion, not thermostats that transform and regulate Are we thermometers or are we thermostats? You know, that's the kind of thing that I'll think back on this sermon and I'll think, what was that sermon about? Yeah, it was about being a thermometer or a thermostat. Did that not work for anybody else? It worked, you know, it worked for me. It reminded me in almost every church I've served, certainly not DCPC, one of the main complaints that you would get from people on Sunday morning was the temperature in the sanctuary. It was either too hot or too cold, and you couldn't make everybody happy. And so I talked to my business manager. I said, why don't we put up a thermostat in the back of the sanctuary so that people can adjust it wherever they want it to be? You don't hook it up to anything, so it doesn't, you know, it doesn't really affect the temperature, but it gives them a place to sort of vent, not being comfortable. Well, you know, I read that, yeah, we need to be thermostats, but we need to be real thermostats that actually work. Over on 645, where he talks about not conforming, nowhere is the tragic tendency to conform more evident than in the church. And he says, called to be moral guardian of the community, the church at times has preserved that which is immoral or unethical. Called to combat social evils, it has remained silent behind stained glass windows. Called to lead men to the highway of brotherhood. Again, that repetition over and over, you know, he just hammers his points home. Back to the point both Susan and Pidge have made, human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. Creatively maladjusted. Somewhere he talks about Jesus being, what was it he said about Jesus being the most, I forgot now where it was, but you know, that sort of language, I think, really moves this sermon along and makes it memorable. Here's the other repetition. Now I've found it. And somebody else has referred to this on 848. We must make a choice. Will we continue to march to the drumbeat of conformity and respectability, or will we march only to the music of time, or will we risk criticism? You know, the repetition, that sort of reminded me of those sayings of Jesus in Matthew, the ego eimi sermon, sayings where he's saying, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. You have heard it said, but I say, you have heard it said, but I say, you have heard it said, but I say. That's the same sort of thing that that King is doing here. And the negative always comes first. You heard this, but I say, not negative, but the expansion of the law comes second. In King, the negative comes first, the positive comes second. I just think it was full of things like that, there's also a sort of coherence about this. It's memorable because it is so precise. There's not a lot of chaff in here. And it all, for lack of a better word, to me, hangs together in a great way. It also raises questions for us. I think it's very contemporary in that it raised the question for me of the fact that some degree of conformity is essential. But when do we say, what is the line in the sand when we say this demands nonconformist behavior? I think that's the real issue for us. When is something so important that we depart from conformity and become the nonconformist? Put it another way, you know, when do you go to the streets? What's important enough to breach civil order? What are the standards? he touches on that, but I think that's the thing that's challenging for us. And we might ask ourselves, in what areas today are we being called to be nonconformist? What are the conformities of modern culture against which we ought to protest, act? Go back to, I won't go back to Neighbor. I quote Neighbor too much, I'm told. Any ideas? Did anybody else think about that? As what should I be a nonconformist about today?
One thing to me, Bill, in the second part here, he's taking the church to task. And he's really saying, I'm not hearing anything from the pulpit. They're being careful. They're being cautious. And while that was, I'm sure, much more prevalent in 1961, I think that the same thing exists today. And it's always a question. Since you've lived that life, and you have a few others here who have to be careful and think about what they want to say in the sermon, how nonconformist they want to be. I think that's an important part of this whole sermon.
He says preachers are just as bad as everybody else, really. But preachers also have been tempted by the enticing cult of conformity. Somewhere else, he talks about the size of the manse and having a big car and so on. So yeah, we're not immune, but your point's well taken. The church can be the most conformist of institutions. Anybody else?
Bill, I was struck by how timely the message seems. And then also by 60 years, how little has changed. I think that this sermon could be preached today, but maybe what we need to do is to be able to examine our own context and say, how do we respond in 2021 to the fact that not much has changed since 1961, understand what has changed and what we as the church should be doing about it.
Yeah. You really could pull this out and preach it next Sunday.
Right.
If any ever called on to preach, you just don't feel inspired to write a new sermon, you could get in full credit and just stand up and read this with a little expression and do quite well. I'm not sure you'd have to change a word in it, quite frankly. Very little. That's why I picked this out, Jesse. I thought.
Well, the other thing I thought was particularly poignant, I guess, and especially in light of how Martin Luther's life played out, was the phrase over on 848 is, the cross precedes the crown. We have to be willing to carry the cross, and the cross has to leave its marks on us, literally, before we receive the crown. And I think most of us today want to just jump straight to the crown and forget that we've got to carry that cross. And of course, ultimately, Martin Luther King died for these words,
Yeah, and right below that,
gave his life, for the cause of social justice and equal rights.
and right below that is back to Jesse's point. In these days of worldwide confusion, there is a dire need for men and women who will courageously do battle for truth. There it is.
Family today as it was then.
Yeah. There it is, right there. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, well, one of the things at least we can be happy about is the fact that we don't have stained glass windows, so we're not conforming there, as he points out in the sermon. However, I think the problem that I have with conformity is and I personally have it, is we do something, but we're not consistent when we break out of that conformity mold. You know, we tend to fall back into what's comfortable. And it's like the parable of the seeds go along the road. You know, we're not producing good grain, good fruit.
Well, and again, I don't think he's saying that we need to be total nonconformists in everything. There's a selective nonconformity here, which is the question that I had: is which are the items? You know, I guess I could have gotten up this morning and put on a mink coat to wear, or I could have worn it to church, and that'd be nonconformist because I wasn't wearing a shirt, but it'd be just useless. One of the important things to be nonconformist about, and then I think the real vexing question: what are the standards? You know, what are the standards? And I think that's the answer to your question is you have to be consistent in the standards that you use. Okay, are we done with King? We're ready to move on to something really different. We need to if we're going to get to it. So let's go to Peter Gomes. I don't have much to say about Gomes biographically, but he was an interesting character. Sometime Google him and you can get some audio recordings of his speaking style. And whereas King was appropriately sophisticated and regal, Gomes kind of came across, at least in my mind, as pompous in his enunciation and in his, you can just sort of see him sitting back on the throne and, you know, speaking to the commoners. That said, he wrote some wonderful sermons, and this is really just a short meditation, but I thought an interesting one. Refreshment Sunday. Was everybody familiar with that? I wasn't familiar with Refreshment Sunday. If you came from a Catholic tradition or maybe Anglican, you might know about it. But it is a Sunday in either Lent or Advent that you kind of get a time out from the discipline of the season. You get that Sunday off, and you can, you know, eat what you want to eat, or, you know, whatever it is you've deprived yourself of. And I had never heard of that. He makes note of this being Refreshment Sunday, which sort of leads into his idea we're going to listen to this music as part of the sermon, as a refreshment, a kind of reprieve from Lent. And I think it's the fourth Sunday in Advent. I mean, the fourth Sunday in Lent and the third Sunday in Advent. I'm not sure of that, but that's what he means by Refreshment Sunday. And I had to learn what that was about. I just want to go through this a little bit line by line and get your comments as well. But he starts off talking about this music of Bach's and how Martin Luther wrote he loved music next to God, and that no one who did not love music could know God, which was a creative thought from that dreary old German boor. I'm a little hard on Luther there, but I liked his point. And some of you in the choir, I see several choir members here. What'd you think of that? No one who did not love music.
Well, I certainly have heard the term fifth evangelist as it applies to Bach, and the fact he wrote a unique cantata or musical work for every Sunday, which That's why we have so many of them, but
Yeah, it was certainly prolific.
yeah.
I love Bach, and to the larger point, you know, there is a kind of spiritual dimension to music that you know, church music, we have it for a reason. It's not just there because it's not entertainment. It's uplifting. It causes you to be pensive, meditative, joyful. It causes you to lament depending on the music. So it affects us. It affects our affect. You know, I think there's something to be said for that. I was walking yesterday, beautiful afternoon. It was kind of cloudy, but it was nice. And I was out on the Greenway walking up toward Harris Teeter from the Pines and listening to WDAV on my earpieces. And there was a piece of music on there. It was Bizet, the Pearl Fishers. Anybody know that piece? An aria from the Pearl Fishers with two tenors. It sounded like Pavarotti and Placido Domingo. It wasn't. These people were folks I had not known with the Welsh National Orchestra. And I was struck. I can't explain it, but it was just remarkable. The confluence of being out on a nice day in a greening area and listening to that music was just overwhelming. And, you know, if you've never had that experience with music, I guess you just don't like music. I'm not sure I would go so far as Luther as saying you can't know God without loving music, but it's a valid point to an extent. In a way, I thought this sermon was very much re-emphasizing what King was saying about nonconformity. We cannot be seduced by the appearances of reality that would overwhelm us by their delights and pleasures, and we are not to be intimidated by the terrors and troubles of this life. You and I are seduced and intimidated every day in every way. We are seduced to be conformist. And I think that is very much supportive of what King was saying. Then I thought the pithiest paragraph in the sermon was this next one, where he slams Madonna and uses her as an example of the greedy 1980s. She was just a material girl in a material world. Even in our search to acquire like Midas, the things we acquire are deadly and unspiritual. Even the dimmest of us recognizes the poverty of spirit in a world dominated by the tyranny of things. When you have it all and find that you have nothing at all, remember the conversation after the funeral of Aristotle Onassis, the richest man in the world. When people asked, how much did he leave? The answer came back, everything. Things dominate the world. Things dominate the age. Things dominate the university. Remember, don't be seduced. The Christian hope of which St. Paul speaks tells us not to be seduced into a false sense of security of the tyranny of things. You know, if you didn't have another paragraph in that sermon, that would be worth reading and hearing. It reminded me, does anybody know Delbert McClinton? Oh, you admit it? Nobody admits it. Okay. Delbert McClinton was a kind of a blues, he was a blues rock crossover songwriter from Texas. And a number of years ago, I stumbled on a song of his. I bought a CD. I like the whole CD. But he and Lyle Lovett recorded a song. You all know Lyle Lovett. He and Lyle Lovett recorded a song called Too Much Stuff, which sort of picks up on the theme of Gomes here. And just a couple of verses. Big house, big car, back seat, full bar. Houseboat won't float. Bank won't tote the note. Too much stuff. There's just too much stuff. It'll hang you up dealing with too much stuff. hanging out on the couch, putting on the pounds, better walk, run, jump, swim, try to hold it down. You're eating too much stuff. Too much stuff. It'll wear you down carrying around too much stuff. $100 cab ride, fog in, can't fly. Greyhound, Amtrak, Autobot, Cadillac. Too much stuff, too much stuff. It'll slow you down fooling with too much stuff. Well, it's way too much. You're never going to get enough. You can pile it high, but you'll never be satisfied. Now that will preach. That's why I love it and Delbert McClinton, but it's the point here that that he is making, and he's contrasting the materialistic, too much stuff world with the world of Christian hope, that which we cannot see, that which we hope for. And I thought his reference here to the baby pillow, welcome little stranger to this world of care. That's passé today. You wouldn't give that as a present to a child, but it can be a world of care, and sometimes we ignore that way too much by paying too much attention to the stuff. There's always been enough mendacity and mediocrity to go around. This is the substance of the material world. This is what St. Paul means by the word flesh. Spirit, however, is another matter. Hope means expectancy when things are hopeless, quoting Chesterton. What did you all see in this sermon that appealed to you, if anything? Maybe you didn't like this sermon. I found it appealing. It was short, I know. I mean, maybe that was appealing.
I liked the idea that it was preached probably in the Harvard Chapel to Harvard undergraduates and faculty.
Faculty.
Yeah, I have heard Gomes preach a couple of times to that crew, and the idea too of not making an idol of success. If there was ever a crew that needed that message,
Really? People at Harvard are concentrated on success? I never would have dreamed.
Shocking.
Well, one thing, picking up on the point of being in the Harvard Chapel, in the paragraph that follows what you referred to, Bill, there is a sentence. When we discover that war is the rule of peace, I'm sorry, let me read that.
Rule and
When we
peace,
discover that war is the rule and peace is the exception, that virtue is in short supply and intelligence even more so. That point to me was intelligence even more so. I mean, here he is in Harvard saying, it's very condescending to me. The rest of the world out there, doesn't have it. We got to tell you about it. So I didn't think that was a way to win friends and influence people.
Well, I didn't say he was humble.
No, I couldn't get a sense of what his definition of hope really was.
Okay.
And how would you define, I mean, for yourself, how would you define hope? Or for myself, how would I define hope? And so he had this, it was a generality of spirit, but that doesn't give me hope because I don't know what he means.
Yeah, he may be vague on that, but certainly he puts it beyond what we see, beyond life in the flesh. I know that's saying what it's not. It isn't saying what it is. Yeah. That may be a flaw in the sermon. Yeah.
I heard Gomes preach, and I found him to be very compelling. It wasn't at Harvard Chapel, but it was at a church in Miami, Florida. But he seemed to love preaching. The reference to Bach here seems to me that he considered preaching to be a performing art, as I think that it is, and he enjoyed performing.
Yeah, he was a performer.
Bill, if you're preaching at Harvard Chapel, you got to have a certain amount of self-confidence to do it. And that chapel has eaten up several pretty good preachers, and the ones that have survived have been people like Gomes and George Buttrick, who could say, I know as much as any of you guys, and I'm going to tell you this. And it really did take a measure of arrogance to start out to take that job in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder if he thought about it very long when he got the offer. But I thought of, when I was listening to Gomes, I thought of Niebuhr. I will quote Niebuhr, where Niebuhr said he had determined not to be a pretty preacher. And Gomes didn't make that determination.
Well, Bill, I like it's actually in his prayer at the very end, which I think is where he comes the closest to defining hope. Going back to what Pam was asking, you know, he gives thanks to God for the invisible lifeline that sustains us amid the temptations and trials and anxieties of this life, that it's through Christ that we are sustained, and through Christ that we have hope for a better world. I think, I mean, to me, that was what I took from it is, and he really talks about, he gives us illustration about this staircase that has no visible means of support. And that,
yeah, I thought the staircase allusion was effective in a way.
the vagrant staircase.
It was kind of I thought, where in the world is this going? And then he finally brought it home. Yeah, I like the prayer. In fact, I was going to close with the prayer, and maybe we'll do that in a minute. But other comments, we're about out of time, but I'm going to go back and do some more, listen to some more Gomes sermons. For all I've said about him that you may think I didn't like him, I really do think he's appealing in a lot of ways. And that's, speaking of preachers, here's John Ryan, who's just checked in. Are you here for a purpose, John, or you just?
I got done teaching third graders a little bit early, so I thought I'd pop in real quick.
Well, we're just finishing up, but we're glad to have you here. Next week, we move on to our last two sermons. One by Paul Tillich. I classify Tillich as an American preacher because he did so much of his work here. He was really German, but he finished his career here and had a splendid career. And William Sloane Coffin, who I just absolutely love. And well, I won't say any more about them, but we'll take those up next week. I hope you enjoy them, get a chance to read them. And next week, if we have any time when we get done with them, I'd like to hear from you about, you've given me some ideas about what you find valuable and appealing in sermons or not appealing. I'd like to hear a little bit of feedback from you on that general topic, if we have time. If not, we'll just go through those sermons. So let's read one more time. I'll read it, this prayer by Gomes, which I think is good. We thank thee, O God, for the invisible lifeline that sustains us amid the temptations and trials and anxieties of life. Let us affirm that hope which is thy gift to us through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. No visible means of support. Right.
Thanks,
Okay,
Bill.
folks. Thank you.
Bill.